Thank you. I left my beer outside.
Oh, goodness.
Yeah.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to the Union today. It's so wonderful to see such a packed chamber. So we're joined today by the wonderful Mick Mulvaney.
Wonderful. That's a nice way to start. I like that.
Isn't it? Yeah. We thought we'd compliment you, you know. Now, Mick is the former director of the US Office of Budget Management. He's more widely known for his role as acting White House Chief of Staff from January 2019 to March 2020 during the Trump administration. Now, you subsequently served as Special Envoy for Northern Ireland, but you resigned following the January 6th Capitol riots.
Yep.
Mick, thank you so much for taking the time to come in and join us today. Now, I'll just begin with sort of quite a broad, sweeping question. You've been in the UK for a couple of days now, and you had a ringside seat during what was really quite a turbulent time in US politics, I think it's safe to say. We've had quite a turbulent time of our own in recent weeks in UK politics. Have you been following that at all? And how do you think it compares?
It's different. It's the same. It's no easy answer to that. Listen, it's turbulent just about everywhere, isn't it? We were trying to figure out the other day. There's no government in your Northern Ireland. You guys are changing governments here. We're having a devil of a midterm election. I don't think there's a government in Israel. I think you can go down a long list of places that don't have governments. The world is just a turbulent place. It usually is, by the way. We do turbulence better than we do stability. My children, I have 22-year-old triplets, and one time they asked me, Dad, has it always been this bad? I'm like, I don't know. There was a time when the vice president shot the Treasury Secretary to death.
Probably worse.
Yeah, that's pretty bad. And in all seriousness, when I was born, we had race riots throughout the United States of America. All of our major cities were burning, which you don't see today. So turbulence is the way of the world sometimes. So are things bad? Yeah. Could they be worse? Yeah. Could they be better? Sure. I don't think what you're going through is the same as what we're going through, but it has some of the same impacts. I was glad to see that you all made a quick decision on your PM today. I will tell you that I was out last night with a member of the cabinet having dinner, and we left at we broke up at 8:45, and we had 4 or 5 different sort of contingencies that we were discussing about what might happen next with the PM. And this is somebody who probably knows a lot more than I do, and all of them were wrong. So we had no clue as to what the deal was. So it just goes to show you that, yeah, it's going to be a turbulent time, but that's nothing new.
I'd like to go now sort of right back to the beginning, to the young Mick Mulvaney. You were born in Virginia, I think, correct me if I'm wrong. What were those sort of early years like, and how do you think that shaped you as you move forward?
Well, I don't remember the first few. Not surprisingly. No, I left Virginia when I was just a baby, and we've lived in the Carolinas ever since. So I grew up as a Roman Catholic in the South, which is unusual. We don't have many of those. In fact, when I was a child, less than 1% of the population of my state was Roman Catholic. When I got to law school at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, I had many of my friends who had never met a Catholic before. It was just that type of environment, and it sort of shapes you. I remember when I ran for the state legislature the first time in 2006. There is a Presbyterian church across the street from my house, and in my part of the world, Presbyterians go to church twice a week. They go on Sunday and then they go on Wednesday, and Wednesday night is sort of Bible study and lecture and so forth. On the sign, it's a very American thing, I don't know if they do it here, they put signs out in front of the churches about what's going on at the church this particular week. And in October of 2006, the lecture series on the Wednesdays into October, leading up to the first Tuesday in November, which was our elections, were non-Christian traditions. And we had Hinduism, Buddhism, Judaism, and Catholicism. So that was being taught in South Carolina as a non-Christian faith as recently as 2006. So it's changed dramatically since then. I think the pro-life movement has really done a good bit in my country of uniting Protestant and Catholic faiths. But it is interesting to sort of grow up as a minority of sorts, certainly not a racial minority, but to be in a different kind of area is interesting. And it can help define you and also help you make you aware of other folks who might not be in the majority in any particular area. So.
And then, as you sort of started to head off to university, I think you told me this earlier, Georgetown first, then where after that? Georgetown,
then Chapel Hill for law school.
And then Harvard Business.
Harvard Business School later in life. Law school because it was free, so the price was right on that. They had a program where if you were a high-achieving high school student, you could come back to your home state for graduate school, and it was effectively free, and that was good. But I went to Harvard Business School as an adult, and it was an eye-opening experience for me, but the reason I went, and you and I didn't get a chance to talk about this, and I'm sorry, but I'm glad you asked the question. I went back as an adult in 2004 to Harvard Business School because the gentleman that I was working for, who was a very high-achieving CEO of a Fortune 500 company. I worked for a company that was sort of a side business of his, and our families were close, but he was a very famous, very wealthy, very accomplished man. And he came to me about 2003 and said, I want you to go back to business school. And I said, why? He said, and this is the lesson I hope you folks take away. He says, as you move up in life, okay, as you move sort of up the ladder and you're more successful, your group of peers will get narrower and narrower. And there'd be more people below you on the ladder who are willing to sort of tell you anything, and they will never give you a straight answer. And the group of people that you can go to and say, look, I need some insight. I need a peer group. I need folks I can talk to who understand what I'm going through, who will give me honest answers. So if I'm pitching BS, the people who work for you might not be willing to tell you you're pitching BS. But if you have friends and peers who are similarly situated, that maybe they'll give you an honest answer every now and then. And it was the right thing to do, and also without realizing it, colored my later role as the chief of staff to the president, because as I hope we talk about, that's sort of the job of the chief of staff.
So you sort of said you were at university, you went away, were involved in the world of business, and then went back.
Right.
At what point did the sort of political interest start to come in? At what point would you say you started to get involved in politics? Were you involved in student politics on campus at all? Or?
Yeah, I was in a roundabout. In high school, secondary school I was, right? But I wasn't really in college, and certainly wasn't in a career. I was 38 years old, I think, by the time I ran for office the first time. And it was really out of spite. I had never planned on being in politics, and I have a certain uncomfort with people who always wanted to be into politics. In fact, people ask me, look, I want to go in politics, what should I do? I'm like, have a real life before you do, because politics is not a real life, and you need that real world experience if you want to be a really, really good lawmaker or a politician. But I had been in the real estate business, and I actually, in my hometown, in South Carolina, when I was trying to get zoning, which I think you call entitlements, on a piece of land, for the only time in my career, I had a politician come up to me and ask me for a bribe. And I very politely told him no, in my very candid way. And he didn't push it very hard. And then about 6 months, a year later, he called me and he said, Mick, I'm thinking about running for the state legislature. I was hoping I could have your support for that. And I said, Mr. So-and-so, it's funny you say that because I was just talking to my wife last night, and I think I'm going to run for the state legislature for that same seat, which was a complete lie. Had not talked to my wife about it, had not even contemplated it. But when that guy called and said he was thinking about moving up in the world, I'm like, if I can stop this guy, I will. And that's how I got involved in politics. Won that race, miracle. I was the first Republican, by the way, to win that seat ever. Ever in my state. I was the first Republican ever to win the House seat for my state legislature, only the second Republican to win the Senate, and 2 years later became the first Republican in my district to win since the 1880s. People think that South Carolina is Republican. It is not. South Carolina, as are many states, is conservative, which is different. In fact, when I was elected the first time, I think I represented 11 counties. 10 of my sheriffs were Democrat, and every single one of the county councils was controlled by Democrats at the time. So South Carolina is not a Republican state, it's a conservative state, and the parties sort of change. The state stays the same, and the parties change. But anyway, that's a long story about how I got into politics. It was entirely by accident.
So how did you sort of manage to make that leap, sort of where others haven't gone before, in a state that, as you say, is quite sort of Democrat-leaning?
Well, some of it's timing, but again, some of it's the changing of the parties. I cannot tell you the number of people who told me that as a fiscally conservative candidate, how much I reminded them of the guy that I beat. The guy that I beat had been there 28 years. He was the budget chairman, and then he went to work in Democrat leadership for Nancy Pelosi, who I understand was here just a couple weeks ago. And when you start voting differently than your district, people tend to want to replace you. And that's exactly what happened. Fascinating story about the election. I fully expected to lose, again, because there had not been a Republican elected there for over 100 years. But we were doing okay in the polling. This was 2010. It was the Tea Party wave. And about a week before the election, maybe 2 weeks before the election, we had a poll come back. It was a New York Times poll that said I was losing all of a sudden. And my consultants came to me and they said, you need to go negative against your opponent. We had not done that the entire time. It was always just me, and I never, very rarely even talked about the other gentleman. And the consultants came and said, you need to go negative because you're going to lose this race. And I looked at the team that I was working with and said, you know what, that's not right. That's not right. Folks have voted for this guy for 28 years. We are never going to be able to convince people that he's a bad person, and in fact, he's not a bad person. So we didn't do that. I won the race by 10 points. The poll was dramatically wrong. And I got a lovely note from the family, from my opponent's family afterwards, who said, look, we're not happy that our uncle, father, whatever, lost, but we are glad that it was you, and we're glad that you ran a gentleman's race, and congratulations to you. And that I've kept that letter. That's probably the only congratulatory letter I kept.
So what do you think sort of drove you to hang on to that particular congratulatory letter? Sort of memories of beginnings of politics, and that sort of reminder to sort of hold on to that.
It's something to be proud of. I mean, it just is. Politics gets to be too negative and too personal. I mean, I know both J.D. Vance and Tim Ryan. I don't know if you know those names or not. They're both running for the Senate in Ohio. And I know Tim fairly well, the Democrat. We play baseball together. I would consider Tim to be a friend. We work out in the gym together. I don't know J.D. as well because he's newer to politics. But I watched their debate the other night, and it was so negative and so personal that it's not very fulfilling. I don't go into the business in order to make you look bad. That's not why I ran for office. I can't justify it to my children. Look, I've been gone for the last 15 years because I was really, really eager in making that guy look like a complete jerk. That doesn't get it, right? You do it, I did it because of health care and spending and so forth, and where I thought the country was headed. So you sort of have to be able to still look yourself in the mirror. And listen, negative politics, there's a reason. I don't know how much of it you see here, because I don't follow the electoral politics as much. The reason you see a lot of it in the United States is it works. It just works. About 40% of the people in my country don't make their decision on who they're voting for until the last 2 weeks. And if everything you've heard about somebody for the last 8 weeks is that they are the absolute devil, it might be really hard for you to pull the trigger for that person when you go into the ballot booth, especially if you don't take the time to educate yourself. So the reason you see so much of it is that it works, but we didn't want to do that. We thought we were going to lose in the first place. We were more than happy to lose. In fact, when I called my wife and said that I was going to run for office, I asked her, I said, sweetie, can I run for Congress? And she said, that depends. I said, on what? She goes, can you win? And I said, there's no chance. And she goes, then you can run. Because the triplets were, I think, 9 at the time. So I would be more than happy to have lost. And I think you have to go into it with that attitude. If you're going into it for the right reasons, you come out with the right reasons. You go in for the wrong reasons, it can really lead to some dark places.
I'm curious about you sort of saying that sort of most sort of American voters will only make up their minds at the last minute. Yeah. Do you think that sort of makes America as a nation sort of more predisposed to misinformation online? And what sort of concerns do you have around misinformation in the election?
I mean, misinformation is real, right? It's everywhere. I can tell a story later on about the article we had our little private meeting beforehand about the CBS story about the presidential call logs. It's really, really hard to get. People ask me, what's the worst thing about not being in office? I'm like, I don't get good information anymore. I used to get the best information in the whole world. Okay? By the way, it was still wrong. It was still wrong from time to time. I know people who are in my position now who never expected that Russia would do a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And they had really, really good data. I think you folks had some examples here of some diplomats who had really good stuff, who were telling your government 24 hours before the invasion that it wasn't going to happen. So just because you have good information doesn't mean it's always right. But I was getting unfiltered information. I was getting information from the primary sources as opposed to getting my information through a filter. And you just have to realize, all of you do, that when you're reading stuff in the news, you're seeing on the internet, you see it on television, it's someone else telling you the story. And it is subject to bias on both the left and the right. I don't believe much of what I see on Fox, and I don't believe much of what I see on MSNBC in my country. And you have to try and figure out a way to get good information. And that's the really, really hard part of what we do. And I don't remember what your question was. I'm sorry for that. So try again if you want, if I screwed that one up too badly.
I think you broadly answered it, so I think that's fine.
About risk of misinformation. We're all at risk of misinformation. There are people who still think that Donald Trump won the 2020 election. Yeah. And he didn't. And, you know, he doesn't like it when I say that. And I'm like, you know, you had the chance to prove that you did. You had a chance to go to court. I don't know how many times you lost, but it was like 60, 80, 100. I don't know how many times. It was a lot. Okay? And you can believe, if you want to, that you won. But you can't say it because you didn't. You had a chance to prove that you won, and you lost every single time, including, by the way, from judges that he appointed, which I think it's way too much attention. I still have some faith in the judiciary, regardless of who appointed people. But misinformation is real, and it exists at the very highest levels.
So, to go back a bit, Donald Trump is president-elect. Do you remember?
Not anymore, but yes.
Not anymore, but if we're going back, if we're thinking back to the time when Donald Trump was president-elect, do you remember the moment when you found out that you were his sort of pick for Office of Budget Management?
Where's Galkowski? Where's James? James, are you here? Yeah. So my former deputy is here, a student in your fine institution, or at least a graduate recently of your fine institution, and he's the only person in this building who's ever heard this story. In fact, he's the only person I've ever told this story to publicly. Yes, I remember when I got the job. I had never met the man before. But I was on the budget committee. I'm a geek. I'm a budget geek, and I love numbers and I love budgets, and I really liked that part of the business. And when I first got to Congress, I'm like, I don't know what the Office of Management Budget is really all about, but that's the job I want. And so when he called, or his team called and said, look, we'd like to consider you for this. I had been friends with Paul Ryan, who was a former budget chair. I'd been friends with Mike Pence, who is now the vice president-elect. And I actually was friends with the Democrat chairman of the Budget Committee. He doesn't like, I can say that now because he's retiring. But he actually wrote me a letter of recommendation. The Democrat chairman of the committee wrote me a letter of recommendation to the transition committee for Trump for me as the budget director. And I remember going in to meet him, and I won't do the impersonation because I haven't had enough beer yet, but essentially he said, you know, everybody tells me you're the guy, you're the guy, you're the guy. You know, I don't really understand the job. And I was like, Mr. President, don't feel bad. No one understands this job. This is the most misunderstood job in all of the government. In fact, the only people who really understand the job of Director of Office Management are people who have served in it. And we will all tell you, we like the fact that no one else knows what we do. Okay? It's our little secret, and it's a great little thing. He's like, but tell me about yourself. Tell me about, what do I need to know about you? And he said, well, I play golf. I said, oh, yeah, I play golf. I own some golf courses. I said, yeah, actually, I won a father-son golf tournament at a golf course that you now own. He said, which one is that? I said, Doombeg. He goes, yeah, I own that. I said, yeah, I just said that. And he said, you know, it's the greatest course in Ireland, the greatest course in Ireland. And I said, not really, it's not. It's the second greatest course in Ireland. And he looked at me, and every time I would say something to him that really resonated, he'd sit back and raise an eyebrow. I can't really do that, but he'd look at me like, what do you mean second best? And I said, well, you know, it was designed by Greg Norman. It's in Clare. It's called Doombeg. And it was a beautiful piece of land that Norman just destroyed with a tricked-up golf course. And you knew it was in bankruptcy, and you had a chance to buy it, and you knew you had to fix the golf course, so you went up the road 20 minutes to Lahinch, a golf course just on the west coast of Ireland. And you knew that it was a classic Irish golf course, and you knew that Martin Hawtrey had just redone the golf course to its true glory of the 19th century. And you hired Martin Hawtrey to redo Doombeg because you knew that Doombeg was the greatest golf course in Ireland. And that's why Doombeg, where I am a member, is a better golf course than Doombeg. Lahinch is better than Doombeg. He looks at me and goes, we'll call it a tie. You got the job. So he's driven by personal relationships. He really did not like Theresa May. They just did not hit it off very well. He really liked Boris Johnson. He did not like Emmanuel Macron because there's very little to like about him. But he liked Scott Morrison. It's human nature, I think, to just want to do business with people that you like. And that's what he did. And he liked me. And I became the director of the Office of Management and Budget. And then the chief after that, what people don't realize is that happens all the time. I think you go back from the Clinton administration forward, every president has taken an OMB director and made him chief of staff. Because you spend so much time with the president, because the budget touches everything. You're always in the Oval Office. You're on every single meeting because we have to figure out a way to pay for all this stuff. So you spend a lot of time with the president, and it's a natural sort of progression to go from the OMB director to the chief of staff, that's how I got the second job. But the way I got the first job was he just liked me, knew I was competent, and that was enough for him.
So you're saying he liked you, but what I'm really curious about is what you thought of him during those sort of early days of sort of accepting the job.
Yeah.
I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, the union doesn't have the best sources at times, certainly not as good as you would have had in your old job. But I think you're quoted online as having said about Trump prior to his election that he is a terrible human being and that he would be disqualified from office in the ordinary universe. So, tell us more about that.
By the way, he never let me forget about that. That took place. So we were all going through election together because we sit in the House, we sit every 2 years. So every single member of the House is getting elected every time. And in 2016, I'm sitting for election, and so is he. And I had a debate in a room about this size, with a crowd about this size, in a very intimate setting, the night of the Access Hollywood tape. Do you all remember that one? That came out, he said you grab them by a certain part. It was a really, really disgusting thing that they had him on video saying, or audio. And that, by the way, in an ordinary world, that would end your political career. Okay, it just would. That's life. Okay. By the way, Donald Trump has done 1,700 things that would end anybody's ordinary political career. He's a truly unique sort of politician. But they asked me, half an hour after I heard this thing, and I responded quite naturally, which is I didn't like it at all. I learned later, by the way, that he actually thought that his career was ended that night. He thought it was over. That was the one thing he couldn't get away with. And there was actually some discussion in my party about replacing him. It didn't get very far, but that discussion did take place. And he will tell you, if he's honest, that the person who was actually the most upset about it was Mrs. Trump. She did not care for that kind of language. So, I'm in good company when I say that that's offensive and that's inappropriate, and you shouldn't get away with it. So that doesn't bother me at all. What was the other part of the question? About the disqualify. Well, it didn't disqualify him, because what I think we found out was that people didn't care anymore, and I don't know why, but they don't, and they don't care on either side of the aisle. There's a polling out today from NBC News. I think most of it's crap because it says that the most important issue in the race is threats to democracy, which is probably 17th on the list. The most important 16 issues are the economy, but in that. They talked about, would you vote for someone whose policies you liked, but you thought they had moral failings that didn't live up to your expectations? And about 2/3 of Americans in this particular poll of both parties said yes. Back when Ronald Reagan ran for president, he was divorced and remarried. There was some discussion about whether or not that was a disqualifying factor back in 1980. So the culture has just changed. I think people are now more willing to recognize that everybody's got their difficulties, everybody's got their flaws, and we do no longer look to our politicians as sort of these icons of what it means to be a human being. It's a job, and as more and more people go through divorce, more and more people go through whatever, they're no longer demanding that their politicians are perfect. I mean, Bill Clinton dodged the question of whether or not he had ever smoked marijuana. Can you imagine a politician doing that today? Both George Bush and Barack Obama dodged the question about whether or not they had done cocaine. So I think the country has changed. I don't know if it's the case here or not. I think if we sat around and waited for somebody who was really perfect, we probably couldn't vote for anybody. So I think we're more focused now on what they want to do as opposed to how they spend their private life.
So that goes to moral character, but what I'm also quite interested in is how Trump was to work with on sort of a daily basis.
Yeah.
I'm guessing as Chief of Staff, you're working with him very closely. You were really sort of on the ground on a day-to-day basis, working with him closer than most other people. So enlighten us. What is he like behind closed doors?
I'll tell you a story, which is really all I'm good for, is stories. Right after Charlottesville, he had a press conference where he said there were good people on both sides of the riots in Charlottesville, and was widely acclaimed ever since, and is still decried as being a white supremacist or a racist or whatnot. And right after that happened, I was one of the folks, I was in the office management budget at the time, but I was pretty good on TV, so on Sundays when nobody else wanted to go out and defend the president, they trot me out for the Sunday talk shows. And I went out on a Sunday, I think we were in Maine, James, for that. And so we were in a hotel room, and NBC News came in. They brought a camera crew, and I did an interview and defended the president's comments at Charlottesville. And as it wrapped up, I'm walking down the hallway, and the cameraman, a giant African-American man, comes running down the hallway after me. He says, Mr. Mulvaney, I want to talk to you for a second. And I thought he was going to sort of take me to task on what the president said about Charlottesville. He goes, you going to see the president later? And I said, yes, I am. He said, you tell him Ronaldo said hello. And I said, I'm sorry? He said, yeah, best man I ever worked for. I would work for him again. I said, how do you know him? He said, I was the cameraman on The Apprentice for 8 years. And I got to tell you, the best boss I ever had, I would work for him again in a second. Please tell him Ronaldo said hey. And I did. And the president said, oh, Ronaldo, I love that guy, and told me 5 or 6 different things about this guy, okay? And you can make your own minds up as to whether or not you can be a racist and still have that kind of relationship. You're going to decide what you decide. But my point was that you'd never see that side of things when it comes to Donald Trump. He would never shake your hand. If you came in, he didn't like to, he would do it occasionally, but ordinarily, he does not like to shake hands. He's a very famous germaphobe, and is quite public with his germaphobness, if that's a word. He would tell you that he doesn't like to shake hands. And oftentimes we'd receive a head of state, and he would stand behind the desk, and he'd motion first and sit down, but he wouldn't shake hands. Early on in my days of being the chief of staff, we flew out to San Diego, where we were building this wall along the Mexican border, and we were an hour late leaving because Donald Trump shook hands with every single construction worker on that job. Again, something that you don't see publicly. Does he have his faults? Yeah, so do I. I got news for you. I got a lot of them. And if you give me 3 more beers, I'll tell you about them. But he is not what you see all the time on television.
I think one of the key moments of your time as Chief of Staff was the announcement during a press conference in October 2019 that the White House had withheld military aid from Ukraine. Yeah. I'm trying to get my head around it, just trying to make sure I get this right.
I'm curious to hear your language, so go ahead.
Mixed stories going around, so I'm just trying to make sure I get this right. Maybe you can talk us.
Yeah, the story is that I admitted that we withheld aid for political reasons. That I admitted supposedly that we had withheld aid until the Ukrainian government did certain things regarding Hunter Biden. And that has become the history of it. In fact, if you go watch the first impeachment, you'll see some of the Democrat prosecutors, the House members, say, and Mulvaney admitted it, and then he immediately said, just get over it. Okay? Raise your hand, by the way, if you saw the press conference or have seen the press conference. Okay? There's about a 2-minute gap between those 2 lines. It has been portrayed in a way that is not accurate, but since I am one person and the media is legion, the history has become that I admitted a quid pro quo and that I simply told people to get over it. By the way, the get over it part was a commentary generally on the impeachment. I still believe this, by the way. I believe that there are folks in the State Department who really, really hated Donald Trump, many of whom were witnesses to the congressional inquiry into the impeachment, who just didn't like the fact that he was president and certainly didn't like his foreign policy. There are people in the State Department who believe that diplomacy should be above politics and that they are the professionals and they should be allowed to do their job, and that when you win elected office, that's great for domestic policy, but we are the professionals. We are the ones who are going to run foreign policy. And that was the source of my response to them about get over it, which is he won. Get over it. Elections do have consequences, and American foreign policy should be different based upon elections. that Donald Trump might have one position on Northern Ireland and Joe Biden might have another, and that elections have consequences, and they should. That's how our government is supposed to run. I've had this conversation, by the way, many times with John Carl. John Carl is a friend of mine. John Carl was the ABC correspondent who asked me the questions in that. And John will sit here today and say, no, what Mulvaney really meant was this, which I'm always fascinated with, that someone else will tell me what I really meant. But no, I recognize the fact it's part of my history, and I will simply deal with it. There was I had a fascinating conversation. It's not the question you asked, but I'll tell you some insight into the press. So when we first released the transcript, I had a conversation off the record, which we did all the time with journalists in order to give them background, you give them context, you help educate them, an off-the-record conversation. And I had a conversation with a journalist at the Washington Post, and he said, okay, the transcript is out, and you guys withheld the aid. Why did you withhold the aid? I said, well, it's very clear. We withheld the aid because we think that Ukraine is notoriously corrupt, and that the Europeans aren't doing nearly enough to help out themselves, and we're tired of paying the freight for Europe, okay? And that was our policy, that was. Right? Several weeks later, when I put out a statement right after that press conference, and I said, the reason we withheld the aid was because the Ukrainians are notoriously corrupt, and the Europeans aren't paying their weight, carrying their weight. He called me and he said, I'm going to run the story that you gave me off the record. And I'm like, I didn't think you could do that. He said, yeah, the rules are that if we have an off-the-record conversation and you lie to me, then I'm allowed to run the conversation on the record. Like, fascinating. When did I lie to you? He said, well, when I asked you back in September why you withheld the money, you told me about the corruption, but you didn't mention the Europeans. I said, really, do you have that on tape? He said, no, I don't, but I have my notes, and we're going to run the story that you lied to me about this, and you've only said that there was one reason. Okay? We had it on tape, by the way, and we played it for him. He goes, oh, okay, I'm wrong. Okay? That was it, but that's how close he got. But go back to why did I tell that story? Go back to the very beginning. We've been telling the same story the whole time, which is that we withheld money because they're corrupt and because the Europeans weren't paying their way. And by the way, we're having sort of the same discussion right now. There's discussions right now about whether or not the Ukrainians are so corrupt that the money is not being used properly. That's gotten some attention in the United States. And I can assure you the conversation is getting ready to happen in my country about whether or not the Europeans are paying their own way. The number one question I got when I spoke at the Tory Party conference back 3 weeks ago in Birmingham was, are the Americans going to remain committed to the effort in Ukraine? And I said, I don't know, are you? And they said, what do you mean? I said, look, the Brits have done a great job. Y'all, as of August, y'all have given about $4 billion to the effort of Ukraine. We've given about 25, okay, but we always give more, that's fine, we have more. I get that, right? You've given $4 billion. That's more than the Germans, more than the Italians, more than the Spanish, more than the French, more than the Dutch, more than everybody except the Poles put together. So you tell me, are the Europeans carrying their weight when it comes to Ukraine? It's the same debate that we had 5 years ago, before the war started. So, no, I'm completely satisfied with why we withheld the aid. I can assure you we would not have done it without a legion of lawyers telling me that we had the right to do it. And, by the way, the law requires us to spend that money by September 30th of each year. That's the end of our political calendar year, of our fiscal year, and the money went out before the deadline, so no laws were ever broken, because we wouldn't break the law. But I recognize the fact that it's me versus the media, and typically I would lose that battle. It is fun, though, to read your own Wikipedia page sometimes.
So, from being Chief of Staff to being Special Envoy for Northern Ireland, something I have quite a personal interest in. So your swearing in was delayed by the pandemic. Yeah. I think you were sworn in via FaceTime, is that correct?
Yeah, exactly.
Gosh, what was that like?
Boring. So they told me, no, I was there for like 4 days, and I said, look, the rules are changing. We can't have a meeting with more than 4 people, and we have to do it by Zoom if it's more than 4 people, and if you don't follow politics in Northern Ireland, they have a devolved government that has its shared power, okay? So there was the Sinn Féin had a minister, first minister, and Sinn Féin had deputy first minister, and the DUP had the first minister. And so whenever I met, in order to be appropriate in terms of the political protocol, I had to have a DUP person and a Sinn Féin person. So there's 3 of us right there. okay? And of course, they're not going to meet without their staffers, and I can't meet without mine, so that's 6. So that means, by definition, I can't have any face-to-face meetings in Northern Ireland as the special envoy. And as much as I enjoy the place, and I look forward to going back, it is a job that I would readily take again in a future Republican administration. It was March in Belfast, and it was 4 degrees and raining. And it was
Raining most of the time.
Yes, and it was sunny and 22 at home in South Carolina. If I'm going to be on a Zoom call, I'm going to do it from home and not from a hotel in Belfast. So,
fair enough.
yeah.
Did you get to visit Northern Ireland many times during that period of office, or just the once?
4 days.
4 days.
That's all I got was 4 days. When COVID shut it all down.
You'll have to come back.
Yeah.
I think the post of Special Envoy to Northern Ireland has been left vacant
It is.
since you held it.
Yeah.
Any particular reasons you can think of as to
No, I know why,
that might
because
be
I
the
talked to
case?
him about it. I talked to my successor. Mark Meadows followed me into the office. You may have heard that name if you follow American politics. And Mark, for a variety of reasons, did not talk to Ron Klain, who was President Biden's incoming chief of staff. I did. And I was happy to talk to him about a bunch of things. He'd never been chief of staff before, so it's a tradition in my country. We have a conference call with all the former chiefs to sort of meet the new chief. It's a very small fraternity, and right now it is just a fraternity. We will have a female chief of staff, I would think, probably in the next administration. But there's about 20 living former chiefs of staff, so it's sort of this small group, and we give this new person whatever advice we might be able to do for what it's worth. And I talked to Ron afterwards, and one of the things I asked him to do was please to fill the special envoy position because of Brexit, because of the protocol, and because its impact on larger European politics. I thought it was especially important that we have an envoy appointed very quickly. And he very politely, and I think not unreasonably, suggested that they might leave that space open because the president had a special interest in it himself. And ordinarily, that's not a bad answer. One of the reasons that people liked the fact that I was the special envoy, people on the ground in Ireland, in Northern Ireland, in London, liked the fact that I was there, was that they knew that meant that it was getting attention because I could pick up the phone and call the president and he would answer the call. And that's what you're looking for, is something that sort of indicates that you're taking this seriously. So when the president says, when the chief of staff says, no, the president is going to sort of be in charge of this, that's a good thing. Plus, Joe Biden has followed Irish issues and Northern Irish issues. His whole career was around in the Senate when the Good Friday agreement the Good Friday Belfast agreement was confirmed. In fact, I think he was in the Senate when Ireland became a republic. By the way, that's a funny line if you know your dates. Clearly, no one knows the dates. What was it, 1922?
For the
Republic?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. You get that he was in Senate in 19... Okay, never mind. I'm a budget guy. I don't have a sense of humor. But what I told him was he's not going to have time to do it, and certainly that's been the case. You don't have time when you are president to deal with issues like that. You're dealing with mega issues like inflation and wars in Ukraine and so forth. So I hope they do appoint someone quick, and I hope that it is somebody who has the president's ear, because it deserves that level of attention.
What role do you think the US can play in that sort of ongoing situation as we move forward? Obviously, probably keen not to interfere too much, but to facilitate a dialogue.
And that's it. And listen, I told people very straightforward, as an Irish Roman Catholic, I recognize the fact that I had some credibility issues walking in on day one, and I just made it very clear to everybody that it's not our job to pick sides. You're picking sides as a special envoy, you're doing the job wrong. I looked at it very differently. I'm like, these are two of our closest friends. I mean, in the whole world. I mean, this is sort of like our brother and our dad. I mean, that's what it comes down to. You cannot name two countries on the face of the planet that we are closer to than Ireland and the United Kingdom. And to pick between them is not only wrong, it's not what we would do. It's not in our nature. So the goal is not to say, okay, you say X, you say Y, I think you're right. That's not what we're there to do. We're going to say, look, why don't we get someplace? Why don't we talk? Is there a way we can work through this together? What can we do to help? And I think that's the role of the U.S. in Northern Ireland. What can we do to help? What I've been trying to do for the last 2 years since I left the position is point out that, and this is probably boring to anybody who doesn't follow Northern Ireland, but it is a truly unique circumstance in the world right now, which is that if done correctly, Northern Ireland will be the only place in the world that has unfettered access to both the UK market and the EU market. Stop and think about that for a second. The only place where you could go and set up a business and make something or provide a service and have unlimited free access to the UK market and to the EU. That's a tremendous opportunity. I think it's going wasted. And if the US can help people realize that and then work towards perhaps getting some investment towards that end, I think it will be time well served.
Absolutely. I think it's about time that we went for the big hitter, the thing that we've all, I think, been waiting for, January 6th.
Yeah, I'm familiar with it.
Walk us through that day for you. Where were you? How did you experience it?
Yeah, I was in the building. I was in the building for the beginning. It's what folks don't realize is that is actually, that first week in January is the first day of work for most new members of Congress. Okay, so you win our election. We have a very long, what's called lame duck period. So the election is the 1st of November, but you're not sworn in until the 1st of January. So there's a bunch of new Republican, mostly members of Congress, and I had known a couple of them, and they'd asked me to come speak to them as a former member. So I had a group meeting of about 30 people, 30 members, about 50 people that morning at, say, 9 o'clock. And the security was so tight, it was very difficult for me to get in the building. I have the privileges of the building my entire life, and as long as I'm wearing my little pin that you guys have may seen before in other speakers, I can come and go as I want to, but I'd forgotten my pin that morning, so I had to go through the whole rigmarole of getting into the building, and it took me an hour to get in the building, which is a long time. I gave the speech, and I was going to sit around and go onto the floor, which I also have the right to do, to watch the certification, because I thought it was going to be historic. I had done that in 2012 when Joe Biden was vice president, and he certified the Electoral College as the vice president for Joe Biden. I brought my kids on the floor. I thought it was a historic moment, and I wanted to go and experience that again. And a buddy of mine called and said, look, they're not meeting till 1. It's 10 o'clock. Why don't we grab some lunch? So I got some lunch, and I thought to myself, you know what? It was such a pain in the ass to get in the building. I'll go home and I'll just work from my condo. So I went home from my condo, and I was watching it on the computer while I was writing an op-ed or something, I can't remember. And I remember very clearly James Lankford was speaking on the floor of the Senate. James is a friend of mine. We got elected together in 2010. He subsequently got elected to the Senate. He was speaking, and then the president of the Senate, who I think at the time was Leahy from Vermont, goes, the gentleman will, what's the word, James? Gentleman will subsist or will recede or something like that. And he bangs the gavel and stops debate. That never, ever, ever happens in the Senate. They don't interrupt each other while they are speaking, okay? Gentlemen will suspend, is what he said. That doesn't happen. And I look up, and they all get up, and they walk out of the room, and I'm like, holy shit, what the hell's going on? And then you change the channel, and now you start to see the stories about folks storming the building. And I sat there nearly, it wouldn't be fair to say literally, because I didn't actually get sick, but feeling sick to my stomach about watching this happen. And I got on a group chat with a lot of my former colleagues, including Mr. Gakowski, and said, what the hell is going on? And none of us had any clue what was happening. In fact, I think I can make the case for you that no one expected this level of violence. I'll come back to that in a second if you want to. But to see people storming the Capitol is the type of thing where you think this is not, there's a disconnect between what you think is reality and what is actually reality. This doesn't happen in my country.
You yourself said in an op-ed, a few days after the election, that if Trump, he would concede gracefully.
He would. I did say that, by the way, and we talk about that because I do get some issues. I got asked about that by the January 6th commission. I testified to the commission a couple of weeks ago. So we're sitting there, we're watching this riot go on, and I called Mark Meadows and didn't get a phone call back. I called Dan Scavino, who was the president's social media guy, who's a good friend of mine, still is, and didn't get a phone back, and ended up tweeting, which I think it may be the first time I ever tweeted by myself. I always had staff help me to do that because I'm an idiot. And I was tweeting all these things about what can I do to help, the president has to stop this, and he didn't. And it was one of the darkest 4 or 5 hours in my adult lifetime. To watch the President of the United States sit and do nothing while there were rioters at the Capitol. I've been very critical of the January 6th committee. I think it's politically a joke, but there were things that came out. When the twice confirmed Republican Attorney General Barr, under oath, says the president lost the election, I believe the president lost the election. When they play video that I can watch with my own eyes and see the violence, I'm pretty sure that it wasn't a peaceful protest, which is what some people still believe. So as flawed as the process was, and is, And I am no fan of Liz Cheney, and Kinzinger and I are still friends, although we have a professional disagreement over his involvement. I think evidence has come out that things went badly wrong on that day, and the president's ultimately responsible for that, and he failed in his duties as president.
I think it's safe to say your opinion of Donald Trump changed dramatically owing to those events.
Yeah, I haven't talked to him since. You know, I still don't think the case has been made that he committed a crime. I thought the committee was going to do that, by the way. I thought the committee, I thought they had a good, I saw their plan. I thought I knew what they were going to do, which is they worked hard early on to establish that these extremist right-wing groups had committed crimes. Seditious conspiracy. By the way, several of them pled guilty to that. So we know there's criminal activity. And what I thought the committee was going to do over the course of its whatever hearings they had was draw a line somehow from that group to the man behind the Resolute desk in the Oval Office. And I don't think they ever got there. I don't think they do. They have evidence that those groups talked to people like Steve Bannon and Michael Flynn and Peter Navarro and maybe even Mark Meadows. But there was never the next piece of the puzzle that would move that from those folks over to Donald Trump. You can draw conclusions if you want to. You can make assumptions if you want to, but that's not how we work when it comes to, you know, accusing people of crime. You have to have evidence of that, and I don't think they did that. That doesn't make any difference to me. To me, that goes to whether or not he should have been impeached. I quit the night because he failed to live up to my expectations as my boss. And you know, I enjoy the position of Special Envoy to Northern Ireland, but it's not a high-ranking member position in my government. So sometimes the only thing you can do is to quit. Still can stand by that decision.
Obviously, with that sort of criticism of the subsequent investigation, do you think there's room for a more sort of judicial process to kick in? Do you think that, you know, there should be more of a legal process, more of a legal investigation? I
think there is a legal investigation, and I think there, in fact, I know there is. I want to trust the system. Keep in mind, every time I say that, people, oh, I can't believe you don't trust the system. Okay, put yourself in Donald Trump's shoes. Seriously, for a couple minutes. The FBI lied to a court about his campaign in 2016 in order to get permission to spy on the campaign. Lie. They gave false evidence. You can never know what's going on in someone else's mind, what their state of mind is. As Bill Clinton says, it's only a lie if you don't believe it to be true. But they gave false evidence in 2016 for the purpose of spying on the Republican nominee for president. If that had happened to you, would you trust the FBI again? There was an article in the Los Angeles Times, has nothing to do with Donald Trump, but turns out there was an investigative report in Los Angeles that the FBI lied to a judge about some drug conspiracy, and they got access to a bunch of bank records, banks' safe deposit boxes. When that exists out there in the world, and it's happened to you, are you going to have total faith in the institution? I want to have faith in the institution. I think it's what's part of what defines me as a small c conservative. But for people who say, look, I don't know if I trust the FBI anymore, they have evidence that needs to be addressed. So I want to believe the DOJ will do a proper investigation. I want to believe that they will abide by the rules of evidence. I want to believe that they will be truthful in their statements to the court. There is evidence to the contrary, however, that you have to deal with.
So I'm aware that we started slightly late, and I am keen to get on to a few sort of questions from you, the members. So just one last question for me, and then I'll move to the floor. Speaking at Georgetown this past week, former Vice President Mike Pence was asked whether he'd vote for Trump in 2024. He said that there might be a more interesting candidate in the mix.
Is that how he is?
What do you know about a potential Pence 2024 run? And
actually, that's not that wasn't the one Pompeo was referring to. It was himself. And I'm laughing because I can't get invited to speak at my alma mater. True story, by the way. And the president's a friend of mine. The president is actually married to a girl in my class, and I still can't get invited to speak there because of my association with Trump. But anyway, no, Pompeo was talking about himself. And I've always, you know, I get asked that question all the time. Who are you going to vote for? We don't ask that question in my country. It's none of your damn business who I vote for. And I always know that the media is trying to do that in order to make the story about me. And I always say, you ask me, really? Who are you going to vote for? Well, I'm not the story, with neither am I. It's not anybody's business. I have said publicly and will say again, I wish he doesn't run. because I happen to believe he's the only Republican who can lose in 2024. And that's even if they get smart and don't put Biden on the ticket. I don't think Biden can run, by the way. I don't think he's up to the job. We can talk about that if you'd like to. But I think Donald Trump could lose. And Ron DeSantis could win. Mike Pompeo could win. Tim Scott could win. Mike Pence could win. Nikki Haley could win. The environment is such right now that it's a dismal landscape for the Democrats. And unless things get a lot better between now and 2024, they are going to lose the White House unless Donald Trump is on the ticket. Because if Donald Trump is the Republican nominee, it becomes a referendum on him. Whereas if you have somebody else and a Democrat, it becomes that binary choice in that comparison. I've said before, there's only 3 or 4 people who could beat Donald Trump head-to-head. One of them is Ron DeSantis, the other is Tim Scott, another is Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, and the fourth, true by the way, Dwayne Johnson, a very politically active person, spoke at the Republican convention either in 96 or 2000, I think. He said he's not going to run, but it said that, you know, he's thought about it, and that's not outside the realm of possibility. But the fourth person who could beat Donald Trump is Donald Trump, which is exactly what happened in 2020. He beat himself. If he runs again in 2024, it will be a referendum on him, and he has a chance to lose, and I don't like the prospect of that very well. Anyway, I think Pompeo probably does run, and Pompeo, when he says there's going to be a more interesting choice, was not talking about Pence. He was talking about himself.
Interesting.
Yep.
You happy to take some questions from the floor?
I'll stay until my train.
Fantastic. Just over there, I think first hand, just in the black.
Hi, I'm a fellow American, and I was wondering if you could talk to me a little bit about how, I'm sure that your relationship with Trump didn't go from acting chief of staff like straight to like quitting on January 6th, January 7th. And I was wondering if you could talk to me a little bit about your state of mind through kind of like the election conspiracies being produced.
Really good question. Thank you. Yeah, happy to do that. Happy to do that because I was the national chairman of Catholics for Trump. I was out on the campaign trail most of the fall in this little sort of swing from Philadelphia through Pittsburgh, down through most of Ohio, Wisconsin, up into Minnesota, where the Roman Catholic voting bloc is fairly substantial. So I was actively engaged in the campaign. And then in the hours on election night, I'm up watching, and we knew that the dynamic was going to come out like this in terms of he would be winning early, okay, because Republicans always do well on election day, and Democrats traditionally do well on mail-in ballots. And because of COVID and the sort of the hyper extension of the mail-in ballot, we knew that the swing was going to be greater than usual. So we knew that was going to happen. But we also knew some states were a little bit different in how they counted. And so I was on Twitter, I was on TV a little bit. I did TV all over the world that night as we tried to figure out what was happening. And the one state I had sort of honed in on was Arizona, because I'm good friends with a couple of members down there, and a lot of their data was really good data. It was available online. We also knew, I knew something that wasn't widely reported, which is they counted their votes differently. They counted the day of votes last. Most states counted the day of votes first, Pennsylvania, and that's when we were going to be winning, and then you'd have to see if you're winning enough to offset the mail-in ballots that count second. But Arizona was different. So I'm sitting there for the next 2 or 3 days going, no, we're down by 14,000 votes. There's still 222,000 votes outstanding. If we win those 220,000 votes by the same as the last time last 100,000 votes, we can still win this race. And I did that for about 2 or 3 days. And then I was on a phone call with the RNC and the campaign. And Ronna McDaniel opens by saying, well, we all know we've lost Arizona. We still think we have a chance in Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, blah, 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 blah. Okay, and it wasn't one of those calls where you could hit *7 and ask a question. So we hang up the phone, and I sent out a tweet. And I said, I'm sorry, what the hell was that? I'm on TV telling people that we can win Arizona. I'm looking at the numbers, and my own team is saying that we can't win Arizona. What the is going on here? Okay. I got a phone call from one of the campaign guys, Bill Steppen. He says, "Look, Mick, I hear what you're saying. We've got a surrogates call tomorrow. Get on the call, and we'll get you up to speed on all this and tell you where we were at, okay, and why we still think we have a chance." I'm like, okay. I got on the call, and they talked for an hour. Again, can't hit *7, ask a question, and hang up the phone. I called him back. I said, is that all you guys got? Because that's bullshit. You got nothing. If that's what you've got, we've lost this election. That was a joke. That's not a basis for a lawsuit. That's not math. That's, you think you might have some, flunky state rep in Michigan who's willing to challenge the electors? That's not a plan. Where are the lawsuits? Where's the data? Where are we going to, Mick? Thanks for being a good team player. And that was the last conversation I had with anybody involved with the campaign, and I don't think I talked to the president after that either. I did talk to the president one time, actually, when Phil Mickelson won the US Open, but that's another, we used to talk about golf all the time. But that was sort of the end of the relationship. When I realized that they were lying to me, and I had been on the inside, these folks had worked for me. And if they lied to me, they'd lie to you. And that's when I sort of said, okay, that's enough. We've lost this election. It's time to move on. And I didn't go on TV after that. So do I blame the president for that? The president's ultimately responsible for everything that his team does. But I really blame the staff that he had around him for a variety of things, including January 6th. We can talk about that if you want to. And I really believe the president, during the week after the election, thought that he had lost and was willing to accept that begrudgingly. There was actually some testimony in the last January 6th hearing where he said, can you believe that I lost to this effing guy, right? That tells me that at that point he knew he had lost. Do I believe today he's convinced that he won? Absolutely. But that's a result of people lying to him about what happened in the election.
So what or who do you think were the key driving forces that made him change that belief? When
he started, he had a veritable clown show of advisors by the end of the race, by the end of the term. We started with the president being advised by the former CEO of ExxonMobil and the former president of Goldman Sachs. We ended with the president being advised by a guy who sells pillows and by a guy who made up an imaginary friend who he cited in his academic work. That's a true story, by the way. If you're sitting here, you can use your phones. Google Ron Vara, R-O-N, next word V-A-R-R-A. Okay? Peter Navarro was our trade advisor. Okay? Peter Navarro got caught by the New York Times fabricating a person named Ron Vara, including giving him a background as a Harvard economist, who he often cited in his academic work. That was who was advising the president at the end. It was a veritable clown show. Rudy Giuliani was a tremendous federal prosecutor in his day. Doesn't know shit about election law. Yet he was advising the president. Peter Navarro wrote a memo on the election, not a lawyer. In the last January 6th hearing, I discovered that we heard for the first time that the president was being advised by Tom Fitton. Tom runs a place called Judicial Watch, and he was giving the president legal advice, which is a really cool thing, except he's not a lawyer. Okay? If you're getting advice from idiots, you are going to do really, really bad things. And I think the president just got tired of people telling him what he didn't want to hear. I'm going to use this excuse to tell the story I wanted to tell privately. It's one of my favorite stories. Early on in my service as the chief of staff, I got a phone call in the morning. I'm waiting for the president to come down, and I'm sitting there. He comes down every day about 11 o'clock, and I'm sitting there reading. He gets up at 4, but he comes down about 11, and I'm reading the newspaper, and the phone rings, and it's one of the lawyers, a friend of mine. He has the office right above me. And he's like, hey, has the president come down yet? I said, no, why? He goes, can I have 5 minutes this morning when he first comes down? I said, why? Because that's what the chief of staff does. Why? He goes, we just got a great decision out of the Fifth Circuit on our border wall immigration policy. It's a big deal. I'd love to tell the president face to face. I'm like, hey, that's great. Yay team. Well, good for us. It's a great way to start the day. He comes down, makes the president. We're all happy. Everybody's off to a good start. Later in the day, my phone rings on my desk. My phone never rings. Ordinarily, Galkowski's phone rang. But my phone rang, and I picked it up. I'm like, yeah? And it was the same lawyer. He's got the office right above me. I see him 6 times a day. He goes, hey, are you going to see the president before the end of the day? I'm like, yeah, Pat, I am. I'm the chief of staff. I see the president every day. Why are you calling me? Yeah, we just got a really bad decision on a border policy out of the 11th Circuit, and I got to leave town. Can you tell the president next time you see him? So I'm like, yeah, okay. So I walk in. The end of the day, it's 8 o'clock. I worked every day from 6 a.m. to 8 p.m. That was my time. And I said, Mr. President, look, we got some shit to go over. Nancy's not coming tomorrow because she's really upset about one of your tweets. 2 senators who are supposed to come to talk about this policy are not coming tomorrow because they wrapped up early for the week and they got a chance to do a fundraiser for their gone. The secretary of so-and-so and the secretary of so-and-so aren't speaking to each other because of a fight they're having over policy, and they refuse to fly on the airplane with each other tomorrow down to Florida, so we got to figure out how to solve that. Secret Service called, and there's actually a viable threat against one of your kids. We got to take care of that. And the fence around the building is going to be about 6 months late, about $55 million over budget. And by the way, we just got a really, really bad decision out of the 11th Circuit. And he looks at me and goes, Mick, what exactly do you do around here? And I said, Mr. President, I'm the guy who gets paid to tell you all the shit you don't want to hear. That's the job of the chief of staff. The average life expectancy of a chief of staff is about 15 months. People made fun of Donald Trump for having 4 chiefs of staff in his first term. Do you know how many Barack Obama had? Okay? That's just the job. Okay? When your job is to tell the president all the bad stuff that everybody else is afraid to tell him, it is not a prescription for a long-term relationship. Okay? And my job was to tell the president every single day the stuff that nobody else wanted to tell him. I was happy to do it. I'm a budget guy. We always told people no anyway. That's one of the reasons I think that OMB directors become good chiefs of staff. If you have a chief of staff who is unwilling to tell you what you don't want to hear, the entire system breaks down. And I had some insight into the system breaking down during the January 6th committee hearings when we heard the story about Donald Trump coming off the stage at the rally and getting in the car with the Secret Service. And he goes, let's go to the Capitol. And they said, no, Mr. President, we can't go to the Capitol. He supposedly got very angry. Whether or not he grabbed the Secret Service or grabbed the steering wheel, we'll probably never know. But he got very angry. And he said, Meadows told me I could go. And Meadows probably did. In fact, Cassidy Hutchinson's testimony was that he did tell him that because he was afraid to tell him otherwise. He said, Mr. President, I think the testimony was, I think that's going to be okay, but the Secret Service will know for sure. That's a person who doesn't have the spine to do the job properly. And when you don't have the spine to do the job properly, the president will break down. The president broke down when he started to surround himself with people who were not willing to tell him what he needed to hear. Does that absolve him of his own actions? Absolutely not. The president's ultimately responsible, there's no question. But the staff failed miserably. And I will to my grave take the hope that if Galkowski and I and our group were still there, that things would have been different. Don't know if that's the case, but I hope that we would have at least been able to tell him stuff he didn't want to hear, because that was our job. Sorry, long answer to a, but thank you for the question.
It's really fascinating insight.
Yeah.
Yes, just on the front here.
I asked Ash Carter at Cambridge, Massachusetts on advice on becoming a bureaucrat, and he said, oh God, I hope you don't become one. So your message has certainly been more optimistic with regards to your political career. My question is, how do you, as a budget guy and as a politician, approach compromises? And what advice would you give to someone who's entering the new era of politics?
Yeah, by the way, I would absolutely encourage folks to go into the bureaucracy. I think it is an admirable profession. I do think there's a value to doing something else first. Because if all you've ever surrounded yourself with is government, then you are unlikely to understand many of the issues that you're called upon to deal with. Okay? If you've never had a student loan, you're probably not a very good student loan administrator. If you've never had to, I was a home builder, if you've never dealt with environmental regulation, you're probably not going to be very good at that. You can learn it, certainly, and you could be adequate, but you'd probably be better at it if you have those real-world experiences. Compromise is tough. One of the reasons I'm not running for office again is that I have friends who are Democrats. And that is a liability to me now in a Republican primary. I'm friends with Joe Kennedy. I hope Joe comes to visit. In fact, I'm here next Thursday in the formal debates. Is it in the same room? Yeah, so the black tie thing with Jay Johnson, who's in the Obama administration. I'm friends with those folks, and it's hard to do that these days. I will tell you that social media has made it even harder. It has. I know there's this sort of antipathy towards the smoke-filled, back office deals. That's how compromises get done. They just do. It's really hard to do everything out in the sunlight. It's really hard to do everything on social media. I can't tell you the number of times that I thought we had a deal with Democrats on whatever, and they said, look, I'm getting too much pushback on social media. Leadership is also different these days. Leadership is more followship. The leaders of both parties tend to follow their party as opposed to lead. And by the way, there's a certain element of that that's not wrong. It's a representative democracy. right? Government isn't supposed to lead the country. The country is supposed to elect people that sort of represent where we are. So there's a certain element of that that I'm okay with, but you don't have strong leaders. I'll use Northern Ireland as an example. Martin McGuinness, Jerry Adams, very different than the folks who lead the parties now. And Martin and Jerry could go to their parties and say, look, here's the deal. We're going to do this. I know you don't like some of it, but it's for the good of the country and the good of the party that we cut this deal. And they had the gravitas to do that. We don't have those types of leaders as much now as we need. And so compromise is a lot harder. The debate, by the way, on Thursday, the resolution is that this House shall go blue no matter who. And I'm pretty sure, because I called today, I think that's blue in an American way, which means Democrat, and not blue in a British way, which means conservative. And so the proposition is going to be that you should vote Democrat regardless of the person. I hope I win that debate, that Trey Gowdy and I win that debate by an overwhelming majority, because I couldn't defend it if it was the other side. Vote Republican regardless of who. I don't think so. I couldn't vote for Marjorie Taylor Greene. I couldn't vote for Lauren Boebert. I think these are really bad people. And I don't think they're very good at their jobs. So I'm hopeful, and I've probably broken all sorts of rules of protocol by getting my free 15 seconds here to sort of pre-grease the skids. But please come next Thursday.
Yes, please do.
And vote no. No. Yeah, vote no that way.
It should be a fascinating debate. I'm conscious of the fact we're running right up in time. But I would like to take just one last question.
I'm gonna text Jay Johnson. Just told him I got a head start on him. So, yeah.
It's a lot of pressure on me. So do you want to choose the final question?
Oh no, because then people hate me.
Okay,
so.
I will do it.
Yep.
Goodness. Yeah, just there.
By the way, no, this is how we do it. By the way, who's come from the furthest away?
First row.
Who's here from the north of Scotland? Anybody? Anybody here from continental Europe?
Who's coming the farthest tonight?
See, I know it's inside humor I'm missing. That's how we usually do it at my events, is whoever came furthest gets the last question. But go ahead, you pick.
Yeah, just there. We'll get you a mic, just 1 second. Yeah. It's for the audio stream.
Thank you very much for your speech tonight.
Yeah.
I'm sure we all learned a lot. My question, just in looking at American politics, as somebody who's been in the Office of Budget Management, looking at Democratic fiscal policy over the last 2 years in terms of these large omnibus spending packages, what are you thinking? Just in terms of, I mean, is this part of a long-term strategy, or is this just sort of fire-hosing money? How exactly do you see it? Oh no, this is the dirty little secret of Washington D.C. Okay, and this is a real challenge for my party. We love spending money as much as they do. We don't like spending money when there's a Democrat president, and we don't like spending money on stuff that we don't like. But boy, do we love spending money when we're in charge. With the exception of Biden, the president who grew the deficit fastest in the last several years was Trump. By the way, that bothers me a great deal. And people say, oh, Trump spent money. Yeah, but if you understand our system, Trump didn't spend the money. Congress did. That's the way we spend money. Every single spending bill must originate in the House of Representatives under our Constitution. Who was the Speaker of the House for the first 2 years of the Trump administration? Paul Ryan, one of the most fiscally conservative people ever. And Paul's a friend of mine, and I criticized him when I was in the White House. We spent money like drunken sailors on stuff that we liked. And I think that we have lost the moral high ground in some way on spending. Here's what happens. Compromise. Okay? Part of the difficulty is that we have too much of it, because the only thing we can agree on is spending more money. And the way the system works now is when the Democrats are in charge, they get to spend money on what they want, and they give us increased defense spending in order to buy our votes. And then when we are in charge, we increase defense spending, and we give them money to spend on what they want, to buy their votes. You do not get $30 trillion in debt as a nation with one party doing it. Both parties have held hands and marched right down that road together. Okay? By the way, does anybody know when the debt started to skyrocket as a percentage of GDP? 1981. Who was president? Ronald Reagan. Why? Because they figured something out. Is that Republicans had always voted to cut spending, and that's not very popular. Democrats had always voted to raise taxes, and that's not very popular. But what we can really do is spend all this money and just print it, and no one will lose their job. And that's happened for 40 years. I do not know of a single member of Congress who ever lose his or her job over spending too much money. I have been sitting in the Oval Office with a high-ranking Republican who will remain nameless out of just respect, who told the President of the United States when I was pushing the President, I'm sitting at one desk, this Republican is sitting at the other desk, the President is sitting behind the Resolute desk, and I'm saying, Mr. President, we have to veto this spending bill. It's outrageously high, and we cannot tolerate the deficits. And this high-ranking, very famous Republican, who you would know, who may have spoken here at one point, said, Mr. President, I understand what your budget director is saying. That's what he's supposed to say. But I got to tell you, nobody's ever lost an election in this town for spending too much dough. They have lost it for cutting spending. Do you want to keep your job? That was a Republican talking to a member of the House talking to a Republican president. So how do we deal with that? We have to re-earn our credibility when it comes to spending. I hope that we do, because certainly the Democrats are not going to do it. I've said before, and I'll close with this, people say, can you balance the budget? I'm like, no. No, we cannot. You could cut the defense spending to 0 next year, and we could not balance the budget. In fact, we're getting very close to the point where we could cut the entire discretionary budget. We spend about $5 trillion a year. Of that, about 1.5 is discretionary. We're getting close to the fact where we could cut the discretionary spending to 0, and we would still have a deficit. That being said, sooner or later, we will go through what you're going through. The bond markets will simply say you cannot spend this much money, and you will be forced to balance your budget because people will stop lending you money. People don't actually lend us money, by the way. We just print it because we are the reserve currency. But at some point, we'll stop having the ability to do that as well. I hope we figure it out before it gets to that point. I gave really, really long answers to short questions tonight, and I apologize for that.
It's been fascinating.
I hope I was managed to maintain interest long enough to get through the hour.
Absolutely, and thank you so much for coming, and we hope to see you all come back to see Mick in debate.
Vote no. Yeah, there it is, right there.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, y'all.